All right, my name is Rachel Woody. We're here at Elk Cove on December 2nd, 2015, and we're here with Joe and Pat Campbell. And our first question that we like to start out with is, why wine?
Why not?
Actually, Joe and I became enamored with wine when we lived in the Bay Area in the late 60s.
Late 60s.
And we used to go and have picnics up at some of the wineries because it was a really cheap way to spend a day. And then when Joe was doing his internship, we were invited to a tasting of white wines from Burgundy by one of his teachers, and we were blown away. We had no idea that wine could be that amazing. And so then, when we lived in San Francisco, we continued learning about wine and enjoying wine. And then we went to South Dakota for 2 years when Joe was doing his service. And at that time, we made some very humble home wine. But it was fun. It was fun.
And the wine there in South Dakota went really well with ice cream.
Well, we made a wine from these small little grapes that grow along the creeks, and they're very, very sweet, but we added too much sugar, so.
So the ice cream pairing was...
It was good.
It was good.
And to back up for a second, what were you two doing? Like, I believe, Joe, you were becoming a doctor at that time. Sort of where were you in your lives, sort of pre-wine, and then how did that change?
Well, pre-wine, we were in Hood River, where I had a family practice. And I believe we just saw an ad in the paper one day for this property. And we really, at that time, had no idea what we were going to do with it.
Yeah, we were interested in farming because I grew up on a farm in Parkdale, which was just south of Hood River. And so we knew we wanted to do some kind of farming when we bought this property. And we had already looked at other properties near Hood River for potentially having a vineyard. But then we found this property and it seemed very, very good. And my dad said, you know what? I think you guys should plant grapes because I don't think anything else will grow here. And it was kind of true because there were a lot of Scotch broom, blackberries, old
There was an old
trees.
prune orchard,
Right.
which had to be cut down and removed.
So anyway, we jumped right in. We bought the property in '73, the fall of '73. We moved in on my birthday, the 23rd of October. And the next spring, we planted our first 10 acres of vineyard.
But I would add that when we arrived here, we drove down the dirt road with a Wagoneer Jeep
Yeah.
and an 8x32-foot trailer, which we lived in for about a year. In the summer, my children, my two boys from a former marriage, visited, and they had to sleep on the bank behind the trailer because there was no room in the trailer.
Yeah, so it was an interesting year. It was a year of kind of discovery, whether we could actually become farm people, and so it was exciting. It was very exciting. We were just really lucky to be able to get plants at that time on such short notice. So we ordered the plants probably in January and then got them in May.
Well, we got some even later. It was in June or July. And initially, many of those vines succumbed to the heat and lack of water, and we had to replant.
But those vines are still down there in the vineyard right now, and they're still doing very well. So it's quite exciting.
Where did you get the plants from?
We got them from Curry Vineyards, and they were up near Forest Grove, where David Hill is now. And so we ordered 20,000 plants, and half Chardonnay, half Pinot Noir. So we had a very close planting. 6x7, which at that time people weren't really doing that. But we wanted to do something that was akin to Burgundy, where we thought the best Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays were being made at that time.
So at that time, that was quite a dense planting. But of course, today there's vineyards that are much closer planted.
And was that an idea that you both sort of came with, or was that sort of the word on the street? That's what other people were talking about?
I think we heard that mostly from Chuck Curry.
Yeah, he encouraged us to, of course he was selling plants, so more plants.
More plants.
But that was okay, because I think that, you know, he obviously had a background of having been in Alsace, where they have a very close planting as well. And it made sense to us too, to try to look at wine regions in the world where they are making the very best wines and copy them.
You had mentioned that your dad suggested that, you know, the only thing you could grow here really might be grapes. Was your dad, did he grow grapes too, or was he sort of seeing what might be happening, or how do you think that he knew that?
Well, he had been a farmer since during the Second World War, so he'd been farming for many years and growing apples, pears, strawberries, and so I think he really did understand farming. Plus he had grown up near Helvetia, where the soils were very poor. I wouldn't say they're poor for grapes, but they're poor for a lot of crops. You can't really grow other crops on these kinds of soils that are basically very, very shallow topsoil and then going down to sedimentary rock.
And of course now Hood River is another wine country.
Absolutely.
It is.
Yeah, what are your guys' thoughts on that? Did you see it happening?
We observed it later, but at the time when we moved here from Hood River, there were no vineyards.
Right.
No, actually there were some vines though. My mom took me up to a place near Mount Hood and showed me vines that have been growing there for 100 years. And so, you know, the potential was there, and they were vinifera vines, they were shustless. And so definitely, you know, the possibility was there, but of course Hood River's a great pear growing region, used to be apples, and I think nobody really thought about grapes that much.
And vines are very adaptable. I mean, they grow in many different climates, many different soils. And we're seeing that in Oregon and Washington.
Absolutely. So when you guys decided we're going to plant grapes, we're going to do the wine thing, was it one of your ideas, both of your ideas?
Oh, I think it was both of us.
For sure. Yeah, we just jumped right in, and at that time Joe was working in the emergency rooms, and so he could work for 2 or 3 days and then come home and spend a lot of time on the tractor. And at first we thought we might sell the grapes, but then after growing them for a few years and seeing our first crop soon to be coming, we just thought we need to make wine. And so.
And I think like a lot of the early winemakers, you know, we just jumped right in. And that was true throughout Oregon. I mean, there were only, when we started, there were maybe 7 or 8 wineries.
In this area. Yeah, and we had a cattle loafing shed that was on the property that had 2 levels, well, 2 levels. And so we converted that. We spent $11,000 and converted that into our first winery. And then we were able to buy some equipment from Jim McDaniel, who decided not to go into the wine business. And so we hauled that down the hill from Rawdon Hill Road, and it was pretty amazing to see all that coming into our building that we had just finished. And we did all the plumbing, all the electrical, and painting ourselves. So it was quite exciting.
And after a year living in the trailer, we were ready to build a house.
Yes.
And so we cut trees on our property and used those to build a pole house.
Wow.
And we did the work. We built the house, did the plumbing, did the electrical.
And that was a few years earlier before we started the winery. That was in 1974, right after we planted our grapes. We just got busy and said, oh, we need a place to live.
So it was a very primitive home, but we lived in it for 10 years. And then our vineyard manager lived in it another 10 years. And then we tore it down.
That's impressive. Because you're being a doctor for 3 days, but like really long days.
Well, not really. Often I would work a 24-hour shift. And I worked in Portland at Providence Hospital, and then I commuted to Longview, Washington.
Wow.
And I'd work 24 hours and then come home and get on the tractor.
Yeah, do the vineyard thing, build a house,
Yep.
then a winery.
And I think one of the reasons we were able to do that is our kids were really young, and they entertained themselves, and you know, we didn't. For the first year we were out here in the country, we didn't even have a telephone. We kind of consciously made a decision that we really didn't want to put in a telephone, and we just really wanted to focus on getting our vineyard together, and it worked out pretty well. We had a lot of free time.
And it was amazing, without a telephone, we didn't really miss it. I mean, it was a full year with no phone.
There was a payphone down in Gaston, so if we needed to make a call, that's what we would do.
Wow.
Yeah, it's hard to believe today.
Oh, absolutely.
Today, when the phones are attached to our appendages, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're off the grid, so to speak, for even a few hours, people can freak out.
Yes.
True. So it was fun, and Adam and Eartha were. Adam was 3. He just turned 3 the year we moved here, and Eartha was 5, and so they were real good sports. They played outside a lot.
And I would mention our 2 boys from my former marriage. They were how old when they drove the crawler?
I think they were 10 and 11. Pretty sure.
Well, we had a Lamborghini crawler
Wow.
that we farmed with, and during the summer, the older boy, who was 11, drove the crawler, and the second boy walked behind and watered each of the vines.
Wow.
And
It seems
yeah,
really strange nowadays when you think about it, but then I grew up on a farm, and we started driving the tractor
Yep.
when we were 10 or 11 too. I mean 11 or 12 too. So, and it kind of just was the way to go. They wanted to earn money, and
we
did
trusted
a
them.
good job.
Yeah. So what did that division of labor look like between yourselves, but also the children? Did you sort of consciously think, okay, I'll do vineyard and you do the winery building, or?
No, we just did everything together, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, the planting, the winemaking.
Are there areas or aspects that you both prefer more?
We both like tasting.
Yeah. The tasting was wonderful.
Yeah, and I think we both enjoyed not only the vineyard and growing the plants and seeing how they responded, and just, I mean, once you put a vine in the ground, if you give it some water the first couple of years, there's no stopping that vine unless it gets disease. But and with the winemaking, it was just very exciting. We visited a lot of the wineries in California, and in 1976 we went to Burgundy and Champagne region, and we just read a lot of books, and we did our experiments with home wine the first couple of years before we actually started making wine commercially.
And in Champagne, we actually picked grapes during the harvest.
So it's exciting.
So you touched on this a little bit, but what was it like raising a young family and also starting a vineyard and then winery?
It was busy. But I think a lot of it, you can do those sorts of things when you're in your early 30s, mid 30s. And I think, and we'd also, both of us had always worked. I mean, I think in the summers from about the 5th grade, we worked the entire summer, every summer. And that was true all the way through. So we did a lot of physical work. And that really, I think, was a huge advantage.
Especially when it got, when we started getting our harvests in, and we had much longer hours. And I don't know, the kids, they were good kids. They didn't have any health problems, and you know, they like when Anna was born in 1979. I actually, even before she was born, I told Adam and Adam's older sister Eartha, I said, you know, if I'm going to have this baby, you have to help. And they were great about helping. And we were also very fortunate. We had a woman who who walked here to work. She just lived over the hill from here. And Marjorie was with us for very many years. And she helped a lot with childcare when Anna was young. And also, she worked in our winery, in the tasting room and on the bottling line for many years as well.
So when you're raising children while you're doing the vineyard and winery thing, did you both think, gosh, I really hope that they carry this on? Or were you like, oh, if they carry it on, great, if not?
Well, we were getting a little bit worried, to tell you the truth, because Adam was Eartha had gone to college in Colorado, and she quickly became a real Colorado girl. She loved the sun, and we figured, oh, she's not coming back.
Well, and she became a nurse.
Oh, she did, yeah.
So she had nursing as her occupation.
And then Adam was getting ready to graduate from Lewis and Clark. And he came to us about a month before he graduated, and he said, Mom, Dad, I know what I want to do. I want to make wine, which was like real music to our ears, because we had kind of thought that maybe none of our children would be in the wine industry.
And Adam had majored in political science.
Yeah.
And we sort of thought he was going to go on to law school.
So.
We're glad he didn't.
A happy ending there.
Yeah.
So for the wine industry and things that we've seen and have had the opportunity to ask couples like the Ponzis, it's hard on the marriages most of the time, is what we have seen. So for you guys, raising a family, still being together, what's the secret? Is there a secret?
I don't think it was hard. I think partly was we'd both been married before. You know, so I think once you've done that and it hasn't worked out, you know, I think you're a little more forgiving, a little more understanding, and that helps.
Yeah.
That's true. And yeah, I think that we saw many of our friends, early friends from the early days of the wine industry, their marriages not working out. And it was pretty sad, and because, you know, we were friends with both people in the marriage, not just one of them, and we realized how, especially like Virginia Fuller and Shirley Curry, they worked so hard at what they did to make their businesses somewhat successful, especially the Ponzis. I mean, especially, where was I going?
The Fullers.
The Fullers. And then to see them, I just kind of like, oh, well, you're not in it anymore, you're out. And that same with the Eraths. So, you know, it was really pretty scary. And I think that I really didn't want that to happen with us. Yeah, I mean, there certainly are a lot of stresses, especially when, you know, everybody's working very hard and new things are being thrown at you all the time. Once you get the wine, then you have to say, okay, we need to start selling at retail. And once you get that going, we need to start selling it wholesale. And so, and then you need to get a business model and start being serious about your accounting. And so all these things are being thrown at you. With a small business, you can't just hire all of that out. And so there are a lot of stresses, and but we were still sad to see some of our really good friends, their marriages break up.
And in the early days too, we delivered our wine. I think for a couple of years I would drive to the Oregon coast. And one year I got, I think, was it 5 speeding tickets or 4 or 5?
I don't know.
in a rush to get home.
Yeah.
And the other sad thing, not only did marriages break up, but there were 2 suicides within a fairly close-knit community.
Right.
Yeah. And, you know.
So that was part of it. It wasn't all roses.
But I think that the parts that I remember from the very early years of getting together with friends who were in the wine business were the times that we got together and really tried to think about improving our industry, making it better, helping each other out. And a lot of those meetings we had at the Tiger Fire Hall, which you've probably heard about. And you know, just the camaraderie, even though we didn't have a lot of time to spend together, maybe socializing, we'd do that once in a while at Nick's. But it was just really, really exciting to be a part of a group that nobody really knew what would happen and how far we could go. I mean, we were just happy to be able to make wine and maybe sell it in Portland for a while.
So back when you were first getting started, what were some of those early struggles that yourselves and the other firsts had to overcome?
Well, I think one thing was it took probably 15 years to break even. And so some wineries brought on partners, and we were pretty determined that we did not want outside partners. Also, in the 70s, we borrowed funds from the banks, 18% interest.
Right.
And not only was the interest extremely high, but many of the banks wouldn't even look at loaning to vineyards and wineries. And so that was, you know, we were fortunate I had a good income from medicine. But if we hadn't had that, we couldn't have done this for that many years without income.
Right.
So it was very exciting. Probably in the early 80s, we finally got a loan from Farm Credit Services, and we were able to build this winery here, and which made a huge difference because our old building was getting very, very crowded, and so we were glad to be able to get that loan.
And I think in the early years too, we made a fair quantity of wine without any of the modern equipment that you see today. So it was a lot of, I would say, much more physical work for us than it is today because of the mechanization now. So I mean, that's a big difference.
Yeah, it was like making wine in the old days, really.
So you're getting started, and you're one of the first in the area. Who do you go to for advice, or how did you learn how to do anything?
Books. Books. No, we didn't. I don't think we really had anyone we went to for, quote, advice, like to make wine, because the chemistry of winemaking is very simple. And so in the early years, a lot of the lab work, too, we did ourselves. And of course, now there's multiple places you can send out and get results. But
yeah, I think that and there was a little bit of maybe a little bit of people wanting to almost hide things or not cooperate as much going on. And so I remember we helped out one year at one of the vineyards, and that was fun and exciting. And we got to see how grapes move through crushers and stemmers and presses. And then a few years later, when we were presenting our first wine to at the Tiger Fire Hall, and I'm the one who's pouring the wine, and I'm very excited about this Riesling that we had made from 1978, and the person that we had helped out said, if it was my wine, I'd dump it down the drain. Yeah.
And it ended up being one of the best Rieslings we ever made.
Yeah, it won 3 gold medals that summer. And so I mean, there was a little bit of, even though there was this cooperative spirit, and some people, we were able to like borrow equipment, or they'd come over and maybe borrow something from us. There was a little bit of the competitive spirit going on there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that hurt. It really hurt. Yeah. But you know, once the wine got out into the marketplace and into the competitions, then we had our revenge.
Yeah, sort of ultimate justice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of some of the early folks, of course, our mission is we're trying to speak to as many people in the industry as we can, focusing on, of course, the Oregon pioneers. And we haven't been able to get to the ones that have already passed away. So Charles Corey,
Mm-hmm.
David Lett, Richard Summer. So we always like to try and ask, you know, what were they like? What were some of the stories you remember of them, so that we can try and capture part of that?
You have to tell them about.
Yeah, Richard. Well, and Richard.
Oh, Richard.
Oh,
too.
yeah. I have two stories.
Yeah.
One is Richard
have
Summers.
stories. They're
We
wonderful.
went to Richard Summers' winery, and he was like he often did. He did everything himself. So he was pouring wine in his tasting room for, I believe, maybe some Californians or something. Mm-hmm. And they didn't particularly like the wines, I think, that he had poured. And so when he was through with them, he came back to visit with us, and he took the wine that they had and he poured it back into the bottle.
Yeah.
But that was Richard.
But he was a very unusual guy.
Yes.
And if you could actually get a conversation going with him, which was difficult, he was really interesting and had a lot of knowledge.
A very, very bright guy, and I think one of my favorite characters in the wine industry.
And you have to really admire him for coming up in 1960 and planting the grapes when no one else had done that since before Prohibition.
And he often didn't get the credit because he was the one who brought Pinot Noir first to Oregon. Mm-hmm. And I think partly because he was reclusive and he was in the southern part of the state, he didn't get the credit that David Lett did. Mm-hmm. For whatever reasons. David Lett, I have a great story. Before we had made, I believe, our first wine, on a day in the winter when it was pouring rain, we decided we would just go to David Lett's house and knock on the door and visit. So we knocked on the door, and David came to the door, and we said, well, I think we'd planted grapes.
No.
Or maybe we hadn't
were
planted.
thinking about
We're
planting
thinking
grapes.
of planting grapes. And he looked through the screen door, as I recall, and said, why do you want to do that? Why would you want to do that?
It was a very nasty
And I think
winter day.
and I think David had the flu, and he was recovering, and so it was a little rough those early years. But why did you want to do that?
Yeah, he certainly was always friendly and very.
I'd say very supportive.
Very supportive. Yeah. You know, just that one day he was okay. But Chuck Corey was a really interesting character as well. And looking through all of the old material that I had on our winery, I was surprised that I didn't come across his name more often. But I remember going, when we had ordered our vines and we were ready to plant them, I went to his winery and said, well, I've got family coming and we need some wine. So I ordered a case of wine, and he said, well, you'll have to wait a bit. And so he took the wine bottles out of the case and put the labels on by hand, and then I bought the wine. But he was, of course, had a huge ego, and which I'm sure you've heard from other people. But I have to really admire he and Shirley for, you know, getting their nursery business going and starting their vineyard there. Because that was when not very many people were doing that, and no one else was growing plants at that time. So we wouldn't have been able to buy plants so quickly. We maybe could have gotten them from California at a later date, but most of the plants were being grown by either the Chuck and Shirley Curry or Dick and Keena or Erath.
The other thing that Shirley did that was just wonderful is that when Chuck delivered us the vines, some of them, as I remember, it was late June, early July. So a lot of those vines died. I mean, I don't remember exactly what percent, but it was a lot of vines. And so I would go back when Shirley was there and Chuck wasn't, and Shirley would just say, oh, I'm so sorry, and she would just give me whatever vines I needed. And so we were able to replant. I think it was in July. When
it was early July, and
we
the
replanted.
temperatures were in the hundreds, around the 4th of July. So it was very, very hot. Hard to get vines going when it's that.
Well, and then our oldest boys, Fred and Claus, they, I think, hand watered 10,000 vines. I mean, behind the crawler, 10 times. They went through the vineyard 10 times.
Oh my gosh.
Watering. So it was every day for, I don't know, 6-8 hours, they would be hand watering in those milk cartons.
But I think one of the funny stories about Chuck, I have to tell another Tigard Fire Hall story, is, we'd come to the meetings and usually we'd have somebody doing a presentation or just maybe we'd have someone from the outside even coming in and doing a presentation, and it was always very, very fun. And we'd always bring wine, and then after the meeting we would have wine. So this one meeting, and I forget who was doing the presenting that day, but Chuck went back in the kitchen, poured himself a big glass of wine, and he came out, and there was a table, like a banquet table, kind of like that size, or maybe a little bit bigger. And he laid down on the table, just like, like Caesar,
Yeah.
and sipped his wine.
While the meeting was going on.
That was hilarious.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. So he was quite a character. You never knew what you were going to get when you got Chuck.
I have another interesting early wine story. We would often work all day, and then we'd have a wine tasting in the evening. And I think I had worked in the ER, emergency department, and I met Pat at a wine tasting in Portland. So she had driven there in the pickup truck with the wine, and I drove, I think we had a small Peugeot. So after the tasting was over, we traded, and I drove the pickup home.
Very gallant of him, I would say.
And I didn't realize, but in the back of the pickup, it was filled with empty wine bottles from the tasting.
Yeah, we were getting ready to recycle
So
them.
I got stopped by the police.
Oh no.
And I was very careful at the tasting not to drink much. And he comes to the window and he said, whatever, I forget. I don't know if I made a bad turn or was maybe going too fast or something. And he said, you really smell of alcohol. And I said, well, he said, have you been drinking? And I said, well, I've been at a wine tasting, but I'm careful, I didn't drink very much. So he got me out of the pickup and had me walk this line, and finger to nose test and so forth, which I passed.
Serial 7's backward. I don't
Serial
know how you did
7's
that.
backwards, which I passed.
Yeah.
And he let me go without a ticket. And when I got home, I realized, I looked in the back and realized it was filled with these empty wine bottles. No wonder it smelled of alcohol.
Yeah.
You should tell the Sandy Reese
Oh, that
story.
one. I don't know how many more stories you want to have.
I love all of these stories.
Well, now, and I don't know whether you know about Sandy and Virginia Reese, but they planted their vineyard the same year that we planted ours, and they got their plants from Corey, the Coreys, the same year. So we became very good friends with them, and they were just a wonderful couple, and Ginny worked really, really hard out in the vineyard, and Sandy was still working at the YMCA. And they were in their late 50s when they first started, so it was quite amazing to see them doing this. But anyway, one night we had some friends over, and we were having wine tasting at our little house down there. And so we had the wine tasting, and we kind of left all the glasses and the bottles on the table. And then about 1 o'clock in the morning, a policeman started shining his light through and banging on the door. And we thought, oh my God, what's happening? And so he's out there looking at the table and seeing all the wine glasses.
Yeah.
Because people didn't do that back then, that much. And so he said, I've got this fellow here, and his name's Sandy Reese, and he wants to know if he can borrow a car, because his car, the light, one of the lights is out, and I won't let him drive home. And we said, oh, sure, yeah. So we let him use one of our cars, and but it was kind of like, nowadays people wouldn't think that much about having a bunch of wine bottles and a bunch of wine glasses on the table, but back then it was quite unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Sandy Reese, we actually just came across his name a few days ago. We've been doing research into the Oregon Winegrowers Association, starting down in Roseburg, and then of course the Oregon Wine Council, and the back and forth and mergers and divisions of what is now the Wine Board.
And he was one of the early
Yeah.
leaders and presidents.
Yeah,
Yes.
he worked very hard in the organization in the early years, and a good person to do that, because he had all these communication skills from the work he did with the YMCA, and he used to be a disc jockey even before that.
Yes. And then even into his, I believe, 70s, he was still acting
In theater
in theater in Forest Grove.
and Hillsborough. So a really wonderful man, and unfortunately Ginny died very young, or fairly young, of Alzheimer's, I think, in her early 60s. But they were wonderful people, and we own the Wind Hill Vineyard, which is the one that they started. I don't know if you knew that, but and how we happened to own that is we had just bought our Mount Richmond property, which was for us a really big deal. Adam had started working with us at the winery, and it was a 102-acre property, and quite exciting to be able to buy that property. And then a couple months later, Sandy comes to us and he says, well, Pat, Joe, I've decided I want to sell the vineyard.
To you.
And he says, and I've decided I want to sell it to you. And we said, well, Sandy, that's great, except we just bought this other property and we can't afford it. And he says, I'll make sure you can. And so for a very little down payment and a really generous, at that time it was 6%.
I have to tell the story. I have to tell the story.
Okay.
I met with Sandy at a restaurant, and to negotiate. And this is the way the negotiation goes. We'd had an appraisal,
Okay.
and so we agreed on the appraisal, and then we needed to set an interest rate. And I said, Sandy, I think at that time, I said, 8% seems good to me. And he says, No. That's too much. I think 7%. So we had to negotiate back and forth. He wanted less, and we were willing to pay more. But I think the down payment was like $500.
Yeah, it was almost nothing.
And then we arranged to pay so much per month, and then we agreed that he and his wife could live there as long as they chose.
What a wonderful deal.
Yeah, so it worked out. Just
Yeah, they were, and he remarried later, and it was, they just were very, very good friends. And I think, you know, there are a few people in the wine business who didn't start wineries and just had vineyards, and they were very important to the industry at that time. John and Sally Bowers, I don't know if their names come up, but we bought their grapes for many years, up until the early 90s. And
then we farmed that property
yes,
for, I forget how many years, was it 2 years?
But they were very instrumental in starting the Oregon Wine Brotherhood, which you've maybe heard about. But if it hadn't been for John and Sally, I don't think it ever would have happened.
No. And actually, that Dundee Hills Vineyard was then purchased, I believe, first by Neil Goldschmidt.
Oh, wow.
And Neil Goldschmidt was very, very instrumental in bringing the wine cellar to the state capitol. So he was very supportive of the Oregon wine industry.
Yeah, and of course that's now Winderley owns that property now, most of it. I think it's been divided a little bit. But John and Sally were very wonderful people, and it was fun to be able to buy their grapes for all those years. And I might just say a little bit about the Wind Hill Vineyard and the Dundee Hills Vineyard. We started buying their grapes in 1979, which was pretty, it was just pretty new to be able to buy, you know, be able to afford to buy grapes from other people. And when we bought their grapes, we decided that we would make single vineyard wines out of them. And as far as I know, I think Elk Cove was the first winery in Oregon to do that, where you actually would name a vineyard on the label, and that wine would be 100% from that vineyard. Of course, we had our estate, and then the Dundee Hills, and then the Wind Hill Vineyard, and we made those wines for many, many years. And they were always different. Different soils, slightly different climates, always different.
I think I'm going to brag a little.
It's okay.
One of the very early successes came in, I believe, 1979, when Robert Druin first visited Oregon. And Henny Hinsdale Distributor put on a dinner for him. And they decided they would serve an Oregon Pinot Noir and an Oregon Chardonnay at the dinner. So the various Oregon winemakers at that time were invited to provide the wines for a blind tasting. And the tasters were all of the winemakers, David Ladd, Dickie Rath, Myron Redford.
Myself.
Yes.
And
after the blind tasting, both the wines selected for the Robert Druin dinner were our Chardonnay and our Pinot Noir from 1978.
Wow.
Which was pretty funny, because at that time we knew we were going to have to come up with 2 cases of wine of each, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and the Chardonnay had been wildly popular, and so it had pretty much sold out. So I had to go around to different stores and buy back some of our wine, so we'd have enough for the dinner.
For the dinner. The other rather curious thing about the tasting was it was put on by Karen Hinsdale. And at that time,
I think it was the Oregon wine. It was an Oregon wine event, honey, though.
it could have been,
But she was in charge.
but she was in charge of it, and the wineries that she represented were Erath and Irie, and I believe Amity,
Adelsheim.
and we were the one not represented by her. So that was,
It was interesting because there was no mention of the wines at all
At the dinner.
At the dinner until Robert Druin got up, and then he thanked us. Very, very big time thank you for the wines. So it was an interesting evening. I think that might have happened in, I want to say 81, but I wish I knew the exact date. It happened in Eugene. They held it at the Valley River Inn there in Eugene, but
We'll look into that.
yeah.
So one thing that we've been trying to work on is, of course, the first argument. Richard Sommer, Pinot Noir, of course, often forgotten. But there also seems to be a major controversy between Lett and Corey. And there's not much documentation on the Corey side for whatever reason. There's some on the Lett side. And we often notice as historians that the marketing materials put out, at least now, Corey's not mentioned at all. It's the David Lett planting 1965. Do you have any insight or tips for us on?
you know, I don't think we do. And of course, Corey subsequently went out of business.
Right.
And then started a brewery. He started a brewery 4 years before
Bridgeport.
Port and Dick Ponce. 4 years before, and I forget the name of the brewery.
Cartwright?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it also went out of business.
Yeah. In fact, I think Dick Ponce may have changed that into.
Yeah, he purchased the equipment from
Yeah.
Chuck Corey because Chuck Corey owed him some money, I think. Interesting.
But I think part of what happened, Chuck Curry had a banker partner from San Francisco.
Oh, no.
Didn't he?
No, you're thinking of Bill Fuller, honey.
Oh, I'm thinking Fuller,
Yeah.
another one who went out of business. And that, I think, was due to bringing on a partner. And then the partner subsequently pulled the funds.
Which is too bad, because Tualatin, I mean, it's a great vineyard site, and of course Willamette Valley Vineyards owns it now. But as far as when Corey actually came to Oregon and who planted first, I really wouldn't
Someone
know.
should know who put the vines in the ground first.
Yeah.
That's what we're working on.
But no hints?
For the Corey side, no.
I think who would know it would be Dick Erath.
He would know.
Because he was so
would
close.
know.
Because those few came from UC Davis to kind of as a group.
Right.
I mean, and my impression was that Curry came first.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't
Well,
know.
he's certainly the one that wrote his thesis on growing cool climate
He did.
varietals in the coolest possible place. which-
He did.
That's why I was given some, I don't know who planted first, but I think that in terms
Should
of
get some
credit,
credit, yeah.
that was the innovative thinking that probably brought David Lett up here.
And I think they probably all discussed it down there in UC Davis.
Yeah.
But again, Dick would know. Was Ponce also
I think he
at
was
UC?
just a couple of years later, right?
Later, yeah.
A little later. But I'd be curious to know who put those first vines in.
Yeah.
Don't you think it was the same year?
Yes, I think so. I think
Yeah.
it's down to months.
I know, but
Oh,
a
okay.
little bit, honestly, like from a viticulture standpoint.
Yeah.
Whether you planted in April or March, to me, I don't know how you guys feel, I feel like exactly the same.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Exactly where it was
Right.
planted.
Right. So I think now it's just with the marketing, especially from the Willamette Valley Association,
Yeah.
as historians, we find it just really interesting how the mythology has just kind of like left that out.
Well, and I think it's interesting too, because I always give Corey credit for the thesis and the idea, which probably is what brought Irie up here, honestly.
Mhm.
And yet, I'll give Irie total credit because they're the ones that actually built a sustainable business that didn't go
Right.
out of business.
Still here,
Well,
right?
Well, and Richard Summers also did.
Well, yeah.
Oh, yeah, but that was way before them.
I
Yeah.
was always under the impression that he himself would say that it was too hot of a place to grow Pinot Noir down in the Umpqua.
Well, knowing Richard, I don't know.
I think he's quoted,
You'd have
I think
to,
he's quoted as saying that.
really?
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That's why
He might.
it's on Riesling and other varieties.
Yeah.
He might.
Right.
Could be.
The mystery continues.
Could be.
So what organizations were you a part of? We of course mentioned the Oregon Winegrowers Association. Were you both involved in that?
Yeah, we were. And
I was,
also the Oregon Wine Brotherhood, which
I was
used
on,
to be the Knights of the Vine.
I was on one of the committees, the early committees of what, I don't know, what did we call ourselves back then? The Willamette Valley Winegrowers or whatever, with our meetings at the Tiger. You probably know what it's called.
There was
But-
the Willamette Valley Wine Chapter,
Okay.
but
Well,
it changed several times within a decade.
okay.
Yeah.
I think at that time it was Oregon Wine something, but I was on one of the committees, and we had our meetings at a Chinese restaurant in Tigard, and I remember just being totally incensed because everyone was drinking beer, and I thought, we need to be drinking wine, even if it is from California. But I've never really been a big beer drinker, so that was easy for me to say. But also I remember Virginia Fuller, at that time, worked very, very hard on putting out the very first Oregon wine brochure, and I hope maybe there's a copy of it somewhere in the archives, because it was a huge thing. For, back then, we really didn't know how to promote ourselves very well. We were doing our best, but
Right.
but she was the one that spearheaded that, and so we had our very first Oregon wine brochure, which was huge. Let people know where we are.
You know what vineyard was on the cover of that?
I think so, yeah. Oh, is that right? Oh my gosh.
We owned
Of the first
Oh,
one?
right.
We didn't own it at the time.
At the top?
Obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
Oh, that's-
He planted it. And that's on the cover of the first Oregon one.
Oh, wow, that's cool to know. Yeah.
And I was actually president of the chapter that included Bethel Heights, because Pat Dudley was, I think she was the secretary or treasurer. And we did not accomplish hardly anything. I mean, we didn't do much. We had meetings.
Yeah. Well, I think, a lot was accomplished in those early years, and I think, the spirit of working together there at the Tigard Fire Hall was pretty much responsible for maybe Dave Adelsheim spearheading the labeling laws, and also you'd have to almost think too. Maybe even Senate Bill 100, that was a little bit before us, but Dave Litt was very involved with Thousand Friends, which I think was really starting to have some political clout back then. And then the other thing, of course, is we decided through the legislature to put a $10 tax on our tons of wine. And so that we could use the money for promotion and research. And that continues today, which I think is great. And we have a wine tax now as well. But I think that's really helped our industry a lot. Those laws that were passed in the early years.
And then I think probably, Dave Lett and who else? They were important for bringing in plant material from Europe.
Correct.
And Dave Adelsheim, I
Dave
believe,
Adelsheim.
spearheaded a lot of that.
The new clones from
And,
Dijon.
and that was really important. And
As far as other organizations, of course, the Oregon Wine Brotherhood is called now, but it used to be called Knights of the Vine, Oregon chapter, and that, I'm not sure, when was that started?
well, John Bowers, of course, was the one who spearheaded that. But it was they were very, very important for promoting the wines of the region. That was, and they provided scholarships.
They still do. Yeah, but I mean, the whole idea around the brotherhoods is to promote the vines and the wines of the region. So it was definitely a really great organization, I think, for promotion, even though it was outside of the industry. And then, of course, next was the International Pinot Noir Celebration, which we were involved with at the very beginning, and now it's what, 27 years, 28 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And then Salud started in '93. Is that right?
It hit at least 20 years.
I think it's, a little more than 20.
I think it's 24 years now, and so we donated the half barrel at that time, and have continued to support Salud, which I think has really, really been important for getting good health care, preventative care for our vineyard workers. And we're really proud of both of those organizations. Trying to think any other organizations we...
Well, we've never been, I think, big
Oh, I know.
organization people.
Okay, I have one more to talk about. Joe is a member of the Oregon Physicians for Wine and Health.
Yes.
And how we happened to start the group up here, Joe, along with some of the other physicians, and there's other people too, we have lawyers too in that organization.
one lawyer.
But anyway, started because we had known that in the Bay Area, San Francisco, there was a chapter of physicians.
Called Medical Friends of Wine.
And so we thought, oh, that's really cool. That's really cool that they have that, because, you know, Joe's a doctor, and why shouldn't that be a cool thing to have tastings and education too? And so I think it had to be like 1984 that they invited Joe and I to come down to San Francisco, and they presented one of our wines at their fall meeting, which for us was a huge honor, because at that time, you know, people from California weren't that savvy about what was going on up here, unless they were in the industry, of course. But as far as on a consumer level, it was all pretty new. But anyway, we poured our wines there at their dinner, and they probably had 100 people there. So then after that, Joe started getting together with Cecil Chamberlain. And,
There were
and
four
John
of us.
Bowers.
Four of us
Right.
who started the group. And the intent of the group is to really promote the healthful aspects of wine and reasonable wine drinking. And so it was Cecil Chamberlain, Fred Benoit from Benoit Winery, and John Bowers and myself. And we met at our home in Portland and established the chapter. And I think originally there were maybe 10 or 15 physicians, but now the group, I believe, is over 100 physicians from the Portland region and from Washington State and others. And we hold
A couple meetings.
a couple of meetings a year, and they always invite either winemakers or someone, a researcher from the medical school, who will speak on some aspect of wine and health. And there's quite a bit of research going
very
on.
Interesting research on wine and health coming out of OSU and OHSU as well. And what they did in the beginning, which I thought was really brilliant, is they wanted to start with the very first label from an Oregon wine. And so Richard Summers, he was honored that night.
And then we went through, and this was John Bauer's idea, I believe.
It's a great idea.
We went through year by year, and we worked up, I forget how far,
Yeah.
We probably did it for at least 15 years.
Good.
And then whoever would be invited, their label would go into a scrapbook and they would present their wines at a dinner. And the last dinner was recently.
Yeah, Ken Wright.
Ken Wright was the presenter.
And yeah, it's a very good organization. And so another, if you're ever interested in finding out more about it, Rupert Kolbegard he's trying to do what you're doing with that organization, getting a history and all that.
And early on we realized we couldn't have just physicians because we needed someone who could kind of do the accounting and the paperwork, and so that's when we invited Rupert to be our resident lawyer.
But they also have
They have
ex-techies. And
well, they now have,
they've pretty much opened it up.
they've opened up a little. They've allowed dentists and a few others.
So one of the things that we have been curious about, and looking back at these the older groups that are still in existence today, is there are so many individuals and personalities and some hardships to overcome to establish things like the Senate Bill 100 and the labeling laws, and later Salud and IPNC. How did that work? Just like the relationship dynamics, the personalities, the logistics. What did that look like? Did it just sort of seamlessly happen? What was that like?
I think it just happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
I also think that, I remember getting a phone call from someone in the industry, and I don't even remember who it was. And they said, do you know anyone in the legislature? You need to call them. And at that time, our brother-in-law, one of Joe's best friends, was in the legislature. So we called him up, and I think, there was some networking going on to make these bills pass. And, because they really didn't know the importance of all this because they weren't in the industry. But those labeling laws, that was huge, because at that time, of course, 51% Chardonnay was Chardonnay in California and nationally too, I guess.
But I think that most of the proposed legislation that was brought by the industry to Salem was really passed always, because the legislators, many of them at least, were wine drinkers. And it was very popular, and I think it's continued to be very popular with the legislature. And so that helped.
So Pat, this is perhaps a specific question for you. And one of the things we're also trying to chronicle is sort of the perception of the women in the wine industry. And was there any sort of particular struggles or stereotypes that you had to fight against as an equal player in the wine industry?
Well, I think at that time there were not that many women winemakers when Joe and I started, and one of the things that we did was right away we wanted to go down and visit two of the winemakers, women winemakers in California. So we visited with Mary Edwards and Zelma Long. And that was encouraging to be able to go and see, okay, these women are doing well, they're making good wines. And I think that, for me, it was always like, okay, I like doing this. I enjoy making wine. I love working with Joe. And so I always felt like, okay, I don't really care what anybody thinks about it. I think that probably at that Tigard Fire Hall meeting, when somebody said if it was my wine, I'd dump it down the drain, I think that, that could have been a real backlash against women in the industry. But I remember even talking to, other, Nancy Ponzi just recently, told me that, how proud she was that I was willing to actually stand up there and be a winemaker. And because a lot of times I think you know, women might step into the background, even though they're working very, very hard, and they're probably involved in many ways. Yeah, I think the thing that's so exciting is how it's changed. I mean, it's pretty incredible. You know, I don't know what percentage of winemakers are women now, but it's all over the world. It's not just here or in California, it's all over the world. Women are winemakers and they're doing wonderful work. And we're lucky to have one of them here at Elk Cove with Heather Ackley. And she and Adam work very closely together, and I guess you're almost like equal partners now in the winemaking, right, Adam? You and Heather? Okay. Okay.
And I think we were from the start. But my perception is, I don't think that was true of all the couples. I think that in many of the other wineries, that the women weren't part of the winemaking team. So that was the reality.
And really, even not given that much credit for the other things that they did too. Even if they weren't involved with the wine making, they were certainly involved with a lot of the work. And that's why I wanted to mention Virginia Fuller. And I know Keena Erath worked very hard in the vineyard. And so, you know, there's not a lot of credit, and Nancy Ponzi too, I could go on, but not a lot of credit given to them even for their role. Although I think Nancy Ponzi, because of the work that she did with IBNC and Salute, I mean, she's totally respected in the industry now, and for everything that she's done. So she was lucky in a way that she was able to continue. And you know, even Diana Lett, she really wasn't that involved in a lot of the viticulture or the winemaking, but she certainly was an important person at Irie Vineyards.
So to get back to the name, Elk Cove, where did that come from?
When we arrived here, there was a herd of elk, probably 30
About 40.
30 or 40 elk that came into the vineyards area and stayed for a number of days. And
There was a lot more grass then, and we didn't have the trellis up, so it was a nice place to come and graze.
so that's where the name came from, and I don't remember exactly how we put it on the label.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember we had a herd, the same herd, I'm sure, of 40 elk that came into the far field back there. We call that the Riesling field. It's mostly Riesling there. And we had a deer fence around it, because by that time we'd figured out, oh, we can't have deer eating our vines.
The fence was 7 feet tall.
So it was 7 feet tall, and there were elk in there, and I thought, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? And Joe was at work, and so I went down there, and I started rushing at them and trying to make as much noise as possible. And they all took off, and they just gracefully went over the fence. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's gonna be tons of damage here in the field, and I look, and the plants all look okay, and one little fence staple was out of the top barbed wire on the fence, and that was the only damage they did. It was pretty phenomenal, because I have heard they can do a lot of damage.
Wow.
But anyway, so the elk, and the fact that this is kind of a protected area, we thought of Cove.
Yeah. Well, that concludes our first portion, focusing on the beginning story for Elk Cove. We're going to pause and take a break, because I'm pretty sure we're going to have to switch out the batteries, and then Camille will take over.
I'm Camille Weber. I'm here with Joe, Anna, Adam, and Pat Campbell. And we're here at Elk Cove Vineyards doing the second part of our interview. So this question is more directed towards Adam and Anna. And like the first part of our interview, we'd like to start with, why wine for you guys? What's your story?
Oh, I think growing up with it and
seeing our parents' passion and love for wine. I guess it was a little bit like you didn't really understand it as a kid, but once you find your own passion for wine, you can't imagine doing anything else.
Yeah, I find it's really home for me. I mean, I think for both of us, having grown up on the property and really being involved as kids in the business, working on the bottling line, I think I was probably 11. And as soon as I could lift a case, I was stacking cases. So it's just part of us.
So, Adam, you actually went to Lewis and Clark College to go study political science. What made you come back and commit to the business?
Well, I think when I was going to Lewis and Clark, I would still work harvests and help out in the summers. And I think when you're 18 or 19, it's kind of hard to imagine yourself doing what your parents did. And so I was definitely thinking of doing something different. And I went away, spent a year in Australia studying there. And I think that experience, while I loved living in Australia, I really thought about home a lot. I thought about the property here and my life growing up. And I think when I came back, I pretty much knew that I wanted to be involved in the family business.
And Anna, did you go away for college as well, or?
Yeah, and I was away for 10 years. It took me longer to circle back, but every transition in my life, I would work a harvest. So I would take those 3 months to come back, and I worked a harvest after high school, after college, after I returned from the Peace Corps. So I've taken a more circuitous route, and my involvement here is more on the marketing and website side of things. So but it's great that I've found where I fit in after all these years. So.
And did you study marketing or business in college?
No, I actually studied biology, but then I started working as a commercial photo assistant about 8 years ago, and just got more and more involved in kind of the media side of things.
And Pat and Joe, what were your guys' reactions to Anna and Adam coming back? Did you guys have an inkling that
Relief.
Well, actually, I was probably almost 99% sure that we would have to sell the winery if we didn't have anyone to follow us, because it's such hard work and you can't keep up that energy level forever. So we were very lucky.
So, and this is a question for all of you guys, what in your opinion makes good wine? Is it more of the marketing? Is it more of the land? Does it happen in the lab? Where does good wine come from?
I think growing grapes in Oregon is such a, really is a difficult task. And you have to put everything into it, and you really have to have everything perfect to grow grapes in such a cool climate, and maybe in particular with varietals like Pinot Noir. So I think, for us, it really does it comes back to the vineyard and the sourcing. So much of winemaking today, there aren't any secrets. We all know exactly what everybody else does when it comes to the mechanics of winemaking. So then it kind of comes down to who has the best vineyard source. And, we've worked really hard in the last 20 years in particular at not only refining what we do here on the estate property, where we have old vines that are amazing, but also finding other vineyard sources, other properties to buy, older vineyards maybe planted by other people, new sites that we can purchase and plant our own vineyards on. And that to me is really exciting, and that's where we're still innovating, is in vineyard sourcing, not so much in winemaking.
And would you guys agree with?
Yes, definitely the grapes and the vineyards. You can't make the best wine unless you have the best grapes.
I was thinking
You can still make bad wine.
Yeah. I always say too is, like the best wine in Oregon next year could be made in someone's garage. There is really nothing about the equipment or frankly the knowledge of winemaking that isn't pretty much an open book. Now, you have to make good decisions along the way, and that's a skill you gain over time, and some people have it better than others. But the reason why the best wine in Oregon could be made in someone's garage next year is they might have the best vineyard and do the best quality viticulture. And to me, that's exciting because it kind of levels the playing field. Obviously, we're very fortunate that my parents started a long time ago, and we have the benefit of these great vineyard sources here. And, you know, but when it comes to doing high quality viticulture, I think, you know, we're constantly searching out those great sites.
And I guess that for me, the most exciting thing about growing Pinot Noir and Riesling is pretty much what comes in the door is what you're going to get, because it already has been made in the vineyard. And with Chardonnay, there's a little more manipulation, but, and not to put Chardonnay down, actually it was one of our more successful grapes at one time and will be again, I'm sure. But it's just with Riesling and Pinot Noir, it really is the fruit that comes in the door that makes all the difference.
Yeah.
I think it's all about great farming on great sites, and I think Adam's being humble about how much he's done to, you know, add to our vineyard sites, but also fine tune how we grow our grapes. You know, there's been a lot of changes over the past 10 years or so with how we take care of our grapes, and I think that our wines have really benefited from that.
So how would you guys describe your terroir here at Elk Cove? Has it developed over the years, or has it stayed consistent?
Well, I think probably the biggest change has been being able to purchase and plant vineyards on in different areas. So, this vineyard and winery was the first vineyard and winery in the Yamhill Carlton AVA. Back then it wasn't an AVA, it was just where my parents decided to buy some land. But that with the classic marine sediment soils proved to be incredibly amazing for Pinot Noir in particular. So we've looked to expand on this same soil type in this same area. Our Mount Richmond vineyard, which I guess we have over 175 acres planted over there, is a very similar soil type to what we have here, and we knew that. So we appreciated that terroir, but we also wanted other things for diversity in the cellar, to make single vineyard wines from other AVAs, from other soil types. So where my parents live is a vineyard called Clay Court, and that's all Jory volcanic soils. I live on a vineyard in the Chehalem Mountains called Five Mountain, historic vineyard, planted in the 70s, but that's all laurelwood or loess soils. So between those two plus what we have here, we really covered all the main soil types in the Willamette Valley. And as a winemaker, it's really nice because I can pick and choose from those different soil types for some of our wines that are blends from different vineyards. And then I can also make single vineyard wines that really reflect that particular soil type. And soil type is really the most important thing in our part of Oregon, where the climate is fairly similar north to south in the Willamette Valley. Where we see big differences are soils. And I consider that probably the most impactful thing about our terroir is what's underground.
Yeah, and I think that Mount Richmond is the lower elevation is, I don't know how much that changes the terroir, if it's just also it's protective in terms of the weather, because that tends to ripen earlier than this property.
Yeah, and when it comes to finding new vineyard sources, like 2 years ago, we were able to buy a vineyard over near Mount Richmond called Goodrich that a kind of an investment banking corporation had planted, and they did all the right things in planting it. But honestly, we probably knew more about that vineyard than they did. When it was up for sale, we were able to jump in and buy it. And I feel really fortunate that these guys started so many years ago that we have the ability to, without partners, just with the family, be able to source the financing to continue to expand our vineyard holdings. And I hope Oregon stays in that same, that successful wineries can still do that. I know if you look at Napa and the experience down there with land prices being so incredibly high, I think that's taken family businesses like that, like us, probably out of the equation for purchasing new ground. We're still in a spot where we're able to do it, and to me, it's exciting. It's exploring. It's innovating. I always say that the best vineyard in Oregon probably hasn't even been planted yet, and people think that's funny because we own these vineyards that we tout as being all this great terroir, and that's true. We love them, but I look at hillsides and I think, what would a vineyard do on that site? It takes time, but as those parcels become available, I hope we'll be able to jump in and continue to plant.
And Pat and Joe, what were you guys attracted to when you first purchased this land? What were you looking for? Was it particular soil types, or was it the slopes that attracted you?
None of that.
None of that?
No, we just drove down the driveway and thought, geez, this is a beautiful place. And the fact that we ended up planting grapes, I think, was pure serendipity. I mean, there was no plan. There was no business plan. We never had a business plan. Nothing written.
Not really.
Nothing
No,
written.
not really. Yeah, it was kind of interesting that this site had been for sale for a while, and we actually had friends who decided to plant in Dundee rather than here because it was kind of an outlier. And like Adam said, we were the first ones to plant on ocean sedimentary soil, and we found out that it's pretty amazing, and the complexity you can get with Pinot Noir from that soil type is amazing.
Yeah, but so far as intent, I don't think there was any intent.
I
It was pure luck.
I think you had good instinct.
Well, that's luck.
Yeah.
But also, you may not have ever discovered that you could grow grapes here successfully and make great wine here if you hadn't put in all the work. So
True.
And there's some
we're
other,
lucky. We're lucky.
Yeah.
No, but there was a lot of luck.
and every day I come down our driveway, I'm really thankful that this is home base for us. It's it's funny because when we were kids, it was more, kind of the farm. We had horses and cows and chickens and
You had horses.
Yeah, you didn't get horses. You got pigs.
You ended up getting goats.
Goats. Yeah, but it was just a great place to grow up, and our parents also planted some grapes, which was kind of a bit odd, I think, as for the area at the time. There weren't any other vineyards, so we were a bit of an outlier out here, but it was a great place to grow up. But at any rate, when I come down the driveway every day now, I'm just really thankful that we have this beautiful property. It's 200 acres. We have 50 acres of grapes, but we also have 150 acres of canyons and fir trees, and it's a beautiful place. And the winery sits right in the middle of it, so we don't really have any neighbors. It's a nice place to be able to have a winery that's also very connected to the land. I know there's a lot of wineries now in urban areas and in more buildings and industrial areas, and I just think, gosh, I love being so connected here on a great, usually October morning when the grapes come right in from the vineyard, and within 200 yards they're getting processed, and once they're finished fermenting, all the skins go to compost piles right here on the property, and there's a real good cycle that we get to have because it's this big property.
And I think the other thing is if you look around the property here at Elk Cove and some of our other vineyard properties as well, you'll see that we have a lot of areas where there's trees, and like the canyon, it's good for wildlife, but it's also good for our grapes because they're beneficial insects that hang out in those areas, and they keep us from having to use any insecticides, which so far we've been able to do. And we're very pleased about that.
And the birds of prey have
Oh yes, yeah, we like to feed our hawks.
some effect on the birds.
Yeah.
They have a food source.
Yeah.
So what is your most memorable vintage? Is there a particular year that was perhaps very challenging for you guys to manipulate the wine and to create a valuable product, or was there a year where the grapes were perfect and just perfect conditions in creating that great table wine?
There was a year that was terrible. And it was in the one with
81.
81. And we had a trailer type crusher stemmer that we hauled through the vineyards. And we were in the far, what used to be planted in Riesling. And we drove down a side hill, turned it over, dumped a ton of grapes. And I remember it got dark. We couldn't recover quickly. And we tried to hike out of the vineyard. And there was so much rain and mud that we kept falling. And by the time we got back to the home, well, we were all laughing. And it was a great vintage, turned out.
Well, actually, I think you were thinking about 84.
Could have been 84.
Yeah, but 81 was an amazing vintage too, because it was probably, for Oregon, it was probably the worst year we've ever had for botrytis infection in our Pinot Noir. So the Pinot Noirs weren't very good, but we were able to make Riesling, and we selected individual clusters and made a select cluster wine, which ended up getting the grand prize in San Francisco for the best Riesling.
So you're selecting for botrytis?
Selecting for botrytis, because with Riesling, botrytis can be a good thing, but with Pinot Noir, it's devastating. So that was kind of the really good vintage for Riesling, really bad for Pinot Noir, but it's memorable anyway. And so Adam, I know you must have some.
More Riesling?
Yeah.
Well, I think we always tend to remember the ones that are really tough.
True.
Really great vintages, we like to drink them, they're amazing, but I don't really remember a lot of what went on at those great vintages. For me, I think just to be a little more hopeful, 1999 would be a really important year for us personally. I think for me, that was I worked as an assistant to my dad for a number of years, and that was the first vintage that he passed it on, and it was my vintage, and I was really afraid that it was going to be a total washout, because that was probably the latest flowering and the latest fruit set that we've ever had. So we were projecting that we wouldn't be able to ripen the grapes until late in October or even November. And I remember going to my parents and just wanting to warn them, because I think they were kind of excited that I'd taken over and they could kind of not have to worry as much. And I said, there's a good chance that we will make only really ordinary wine this year, and no single vineyard wine, no reserve quality wine. If you just look at the average, that's what we're going to end up with, because you can't project that you're going to start harvest in late October and not have it be, in most years, really a train wreck. And we just had literally the nicest October into November weather we've ever had, and it's turned into a classic vintage, not just for us, but for all of Oregon.
You don't know until the grapes are in.
Yeah.
That's right.
And even then, you're guessing until you taste the wine.
So when it comes to winemaking philosophy, how has Joe and Pat, your winemaking philosophy influenced Adam? And then Adam, how do you think your winemaking philosophy differs from your parents?
Well, I'm going to have to give Joe credit for being a doctor and always reminding us of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, because that's kind of how we went into winemaking is, first of all, don't screw it up, right, by adding something stupid or putting something bad on your grapevines that could actually, and it happened. It's happened to quite a few vineyards and quite a few wineries. Anyway, and then when you get those grapes in, it's okay. Babysit them well. Top your wines often, And there's so many other things that you should do that are basically just taking care of those grapes. And so that's my philosophy.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many things that I learned from my parents, and I think some of it, it's interesting because some of it I don't even think we really realize, but I think having both our parents be so involved in the vineyard and winery at our early age, they talked about winemaking constantly and talked about the business constantly, and to the point where I think the kids would be like, "I'm sick of you talking about wine. Why we talk about something else?" And, but in reality, I think that I can reflect back on those things, and I've learned so much from just kind of having it as an experience of all through my childhood. I think in terms of actual winemaking, I think the do no harm thing is key. I think I've taken on that role of being a steward to the wines the grapes that we bring in, and it's often what you don't do that's the most important thing, and intervention in the winery. You have to do it sometimes, but I think for the most part, if you can really just let the grapes shine through, that's key. And over the last, I think 15, 20 years, winemaking's evolved everywhere, and especially in Oregon, and we do some things different than we used to do. But I think that's more just an evolution that we've all experienced, and ultimately, like I was saying before, it really does come down to grape sourcing and quality of the vineyards that you own.
So how have you guys seen Elk Cove evolve throughout the years?
It's a broad question.
I know. Whether that be from a marketing standpoint or from expanding your business, the qualities of your wine.
I think, just to follow up on what I was talking about before, the business has really changed, every year, really. And we're in a constant growth pattern of planting more vineyards and trying to expand the business. And it really is different. Like when I came back to the family business in 94, 95, it wasn't much bigger than my parents and myself. We had maybe one or two other full-time employees. And a lot of what I do now is kind of creating a team of people, and we have so many more acres and so much more wine, and managing a great team of professionals that back in the early 90s, not only us, I don't think any Oregon winery was able to really hire and retain professional people in those really important jobs. It was just the owners that had to do it, the founders that had to do it. And I'm really glad we've evolved into a situation where we can afford to hire true professionals in the vineyard, the winery, winemaking, and in sales and marketing, administration.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. It really has. I think the early winemakers, they really got the quality of Oregon wine up, and over the years have had so much more interest in both in Oregon and in other markets that I think it's expanded beyond what anyone could have imagined back in the day.
And I think Adam has been such a really good manager working with our employees. That's been really key. But also, when Adam came back to join the business, then it was somewhat easy to go out there and say, okay, let's buy this 102-acre property that's down the road, which is Mount Richmond now. Only it's expanded because we bought the property across the road as well. But it was easy to kind of make that leap. But if it would have been just Joe and I, and we were getting older, of course, I was like, how can we do that? Yeah. So it's.
I think the other change that Adam has really made is in limiting the amount of grapes you put on each vine. Because I think in the early years we overcropped the vines many years. We really had, it took us a long time to figure out. You really had to limit the number of clusters per vine. And I think today they've really gotten that down to where it makes a huge difference in the quality of the wines.
Yeah, early days it was, I mean, not just here, it was every winery in Oregon. And what we tended to see was these kind of on and off year cycles where you'd end up with a really big crop, and then the vines would produce a very small crop. And it kind of led to this notion about Oregon that our quality was inconsistent, because it kind of was, because you can't go from a really big crop to a really small crop and not have it affect quality. And so starting in the early 90s, I think paying really close attention to crop level of each vine, and what that's allowed us to do is it regulates the vine to basically produce the same amount every year. And if it is a little heavy, we'll take some off, but we can get this consistent quality, which I think, Oregon had to evolve as an industry.
I think it made a huge difference.
And especially in such a cool climate. Yeah.
And I think I might be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but as far as the evolution, I think it's been great that we were finally, after I did the bookkeeping for so many years, able to hire a full-time bookkeeper, hire some good salespeople, and then with Anna coming on, we could work more on our social media and artistic direction, and so it's been a wonderful evolution, I would say, for our family and for Elk Cove.
I had a question actually about that. So knowing, about how many tons per acre is ideal here. I mean, I know it depends on weather a little bit, but like, where did that knowledge come from? Was that kind of crowdsourced from different vineyardists and wineries working together, or was it something that came from studies?
There's definitely research both out of Europe and that Oregon State has done, but honestly a lot of it has been more talking to your peers, working together and making your own trials. And we did that in the early days where we cut off half the fruit on a certain vineyard and make the two wines separately, and then blind taste it.
And it was trial and error.
And then you can't fool yourself. If you blind taste it and one's better than the other, you had
And
an
I
answer.
think that evolved to where today every grape grower knows that. They all know it.
Yeah.
And with Pinot Noir, they have to do it, and they all do it.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anyone that's trying to double the production.
The other big evolution, I think earlier, Pat said that, their goal here was to make some wine, sell it out of the cellar door. Maybe some folks in Portland would like to try it. And I always think that's amazing that was really all you could envision, because there was no model or history for doing anything different. That was that was shooting for the moon.
Yeah.
And now we sell wine throughout the United States in every state, 12 export markets. I think as lifelong Oregonians, we're really proud of the fact that we get to bring dollars home to Oregon from wines that we sell overseas or in New York or Chicago. Bring dollars home to Oregon to plant more vineyard, employ more people. I think the evolution of the industry and the evolution of our ability to be profitable doing it has allowed us not only to expand but also to fulfill our desire to provide living wage jobs for all employees. So for all of our vineyard workers, we are able to provide health care, 401k, paid time off. For folks that work in agriculture, all originally from Mexico or Central America, they're so important to what we do here. And farming 300 plus acres, they're our most important employees. And we figured out how to, through having them help inside with bottling, harvest, planting more vineyards every year, always keeping something on the docket to have them do, that we can, for the majority of our vineyard workers, it's not a seasonal job anymore. It's a professional job. They're the ones that they know more about pruning than I do.
Yeah, it really becomes a skill.
And so they need health care. They need living wage jobs. They need, and it's not that we don't hire seasonal workers. Obviously, for harvesting the grapes, we don't have enough people. But if we can have each person on our core crew provide a value add by driving the tractor, by helping in harvest, by fixing equipment, planting new vineyards, it's amazing what we can do. And that's something I don't think, we couldn't even imagine in the early days.
In the early days, many of our workers, most of them, were undocumented. And when they had an amnesty, most of them then became U.S. citizens. And today it's so different. I work a few days a month at an urgent care clinic now, and to me it's amazing. The Hispanic workers will come in, they're covered by workers' comp insurance. You never would have seen that. So that's a wonderful change.
Yeah, and in fact, I remember the very first vineyard worker we ever hired. We hired him to help pick grapes at harvest, and his wife and he would go into the vineyard, and she would go ahead of him and take off the leaves so that he could see the grapes. And they lived in their car, right up at the top of the driveway. And then every few nights, they'd come down and they'd take a shower at our house. I mean, that's how dire it was back then, because it was so hard to find really good workers. I mean, they were terrified.
A lot of volunteers.
We had volunteers.
Some of those old photos.
We had a lot of volunteers in the early years, but
us as teenagers.
Absolutely.
I think a lot about like quality control in the vineyard and how much better it must be now. But, we've had this steady crew, and they're highly skilled.
And I think they're going on, like some of our workers, they've been with us for over 15 years, right?
Yeah.
Which is pretty great.
Yeah, I mean overall at Elk Cove, very good retention. So, and I think that shows how the industry is really starting to thrive, but also how Adam's a great manager.
Yeah, and like I said, I feel fortunate that the industry is successful enough now we can live up to the ideals that we want to put forth.
Yeah, it's just incredible to think about like how much it's changed. Like we get tourists here. Like every day we get tourists.
Yeah.
Just incredible. I mean, we have wine club members that like this last
all throughout the U.S.
club dinner, we had some people who flew out here from Virginia to go to the dinner that we put on. It's just it's so different. I mean, people on the East Coast are hearing about Oregon wine, and it's just.
I might comment about the marketing in the early years. When we started to venture out to places like New York and Boston, they laughed at us. They really didn't even want to taste the wines. It is so different.
Yeah, I have a kind of an interesting historical, maybe slightly off the subject, but I think it's important. In I think it was 84, we went, quite a few of the winemakers from Oregon went down to Dallas, Texas, where they had a big, they called it the Dallas Morning News event. And so there were a lot of us from Oregon, a lot of Oregon winemakers, and then there were a lot of Washington winemakers. And at that time, we as an industry were sort of in line with, it was like going to be a Northwest thing. It's going to be Pacific Northwest winemaking, because some people we were still getting wines from Washington. Washington was seeing Oregon's doing pretty well, and so we kind of were aligning ourselves all together. And it all fell apart one evening, and I will never forget this, because there were about 16 of us winemakers, and we were at a nice restaurant in Dallas, and it was an Italian restaurant. But one of us naively asked, "Do you have any wines from the Northwest?" And they said, "You mean Northwest Italy?" And so, of course, then at that time we thought, oh my gosh, this is a huge problem because Northwest is too ambiguous. You need to be Oregon, you need to be Washington. And that's exactly what happened the following years. Oregon started doing their own marketing, Washington started doing their own, and then both viticultural areas have been really successful, or all of our viticultural areas.
Unless you're making wine in the porch. Right?
Yeah, yeah, and then it's yeah, back and forth, or even Eastern Oregon too. Yeah, a little bit.
So, Pat, you talked about some of the challenges in terms of marketing your wines. Do you guys, were there any other challenges that you guys had to overcome to get to the success that Elk Cove is experiencing today?
Hard to pick just
Financing.
one.
Yeah, and we've
Yeah.
already talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been good. We've had the ability to grow in a smart way and incrementally, and that's been really good. I feel really fortunate that we have been able to secure financing from good lenders out there that basically are willing to bank on us, that we're doing good work. Today we're, essentially when we buy new properties, we're able to finance with people that essentially a big part of what they do is taste the wine. They look at the books too. They want to make sure that you're running a solid business and that you have good key people in place, but they also taste the wine and realize that if you're doing good work that they want to be a partner with you. And, honestly, those are the only kind of partners that we want to have are ones that we can pay off the note and not have them as partners anymore if we don't want them. So, yeah. And, I don't know, it's not just Anna and I, we have two brothers and two brothers and a sister. And so it's been fun kind of getting them, I guess, educated about what we're doing here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can't think of it. I mean, obviously the marketing is huge, and it's not just marketing. It's not just simple marketing. We have our retail outlet here at the winery, and then we have our wine club, and then we have our wholesale sales, and we have our international sales. So it's really pretty complex. And that's why it's nice to be able to afford to hire good people and have Adam managing these good people, and for Anna to be getting the message out on our website. And
I was, one of the challenges I think for any family business is kind of figuring out how you can all get along and all that. And it's a good industry for kind of collaborative work amongst wineries. So I think every second generation kind of person that comes into the industry, I'll end up taking them out to lunch and we'll chat about, my path, and I'm interested in what they've done. And, the thing I always tell them is, bring something to the table. Don't just, our parents were innovators, entrepreneurs. Be the same thing, take the business in an even greater direction, because that's how you're going to be appreciated. And it would be a disservice to our parents if we didn't push to be the same kind of entrepreneurs that they were, and that's as a growing business and having to afford all the things that we want to do in life. If you don't grow, you're not going to be able to attain that.
And I think Pat and I are very grateful that all of our kids get along. They really do. Well, from what we can observe.
yeah,
From what we can observe.
it's true, and I think I feel really good about having been able to include them in our business, which is not true of all of the people that we know. And I think, unfortunately, it's for whatever reason, not being able to include them. I don't know what it might involve, but it hasn't been good for their businesses not to be able to take it to the next generation.
Well, I think it was tough when Adam I mean, that time period was harder. I think now it's a lot easier for the next
That's true.
generation to see,
Absolutely.
like, that it's a sustainable business. It's something that is going to really be a career. Like, I think you were one of the first.
Yeah, and like most of the pioneer wine families of Oregon, I mean, you guys were in the same boat where you didn't have a retirement plan. You didn't have money outside the business. It was all here and tied up, and I feel really fortunate that they were willing to take a chance on, having me take over in the mid to late 90s, because that's an incredible risk. I think I only realize that now as an older adult, that if that really is your only kind of nest egg or retirement, to hand that off, and it's not that they weren't still involved, but for the most part, handing it off to your kid, to me it's a big risk. Good thing we've done well.
People always have a bit of intuition. Like I said.
Well, also you're also not very focused on, you're much less focused on money than most people in the world. So I think that helped too, that you were just like, well, it'll probably work out.
And if we had a family plan, the vineyards, we have turned those over to our children. I think
It's a tax plan.
all of them except for 5%. But like Adam says, the winery now is really our retirement.
Yeah, and that's a responsibility, and one that I'm happy to take on, is that it does have to pay for your family, my family. We have to be successful, and the vineyards and being able to expand and buy more vineyards and plant more vineyards. That's a real long-term plan that helps the winery and helps our wine quality, but it's also good for all of your kids.
So where do you guys see the future of Elk Cove going towards? And then follow-up question being, where do you guys see the broader Oregon wine industry going towards?
Just like Napa. The story now is like, oh, you're not Napa yet, don't become Napa. I've barely been to Napa, but I think it's hard to imagine in 20 years. But I think that the Oregon wine industry, people are really being careful about it. Like, I think Oregon is known for this kind of long-term planning historically, and I think the wine industry is taking that on. But
Well, I think for Elk Cove, I would hope that, I've got 3 kids, Anna has 2 kids, they're pretty young, but my brothers and sisters have kids. It'd be nice if one or more of them took an interest in it. It's interesting because sometimes I feel a little hypocritical, because I tell my kids, well, if you want to do it, you go to school and learn to be a winemaker, you have to work for other wineries, you have to do all this stuff that I didn't really do. But I think in today's day and age, that is really what you need to do. And for a business this size, it's a lot bigger than it was 20 years ago. It's probably 5 times bigger. They need to bring something to the table. And if they do that, then gosh, it's amazing. We could have a 3rd generation kind of family business, which would be great. But they have to bring something to the table, be entrepreneurial, be innovators, not just because that's important to me, but
and hopefully they'll have to bring a love of wine and of maybe growing plants, growing things.
Yeah.
Without that, I think it would be hard. But there are sales jobs, but even our salespeople, I think they get out and work with us at Harvest some and really appreciate what we do in the vineyards.
And they could passionately take on one portion of the business, which would be probably the best evolution for Elk Cove. But in your other question, the broader question of where Oregon is going, it kind of ties into that, because one of the reasons why I wouldn't want anybody in our family to join the business unless they really brought something to the table and they were willing to really try to push because there's so many people in Oregon now. There's 700 wineries. There's 50 to 100 new wineries every year. There's the competition is going to be fierce, and if we don't do everything we can to maintain quality and be innovative and entrepreneurial, then our time will fade too. So and it's you could say that would make you nervous or scared, but it's just, to me, it's just kind of exciting. So.
It's the next.
And I think even like years and years ago, I remember somebody equating going into the wine business as being on a fast-moving train, and it's true. It's still true today. If we don't keep up and do our very best here at Elk Cove, then we could be not in your next history.
Yeah, you'll be forgotten pretty quickly if you're not doing great work.
We'll be like the Curry.
Yeah, but I think that if you look at some of those early books, it's kind of shocking that oh gosh, they're not here, and they haven't been here for a long time.
A lot of wineries didn't make it. And you better be on your game, and we're doing things to help provide for that, such as owning our own vineyards and planting new vineyards and trying to explore and find the best possible sites to grow grapes. And to me, that's a good long-term plan for our business.
It's really key.
Yeah.
If you look at other wine growing regions in Europe where they've achieved a lot of acclaim, it's very hard to even buy, a couple acres or 1 acre.
Or a few rows of vines.
Yeah, I mean, we're here, it's like, Adam drives around and Joe and I drive around too, and Anna probably too. You just look, oh my gosh, that would be such a good vineyard there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're really lucky to be in an expanding wine region. Yeah. But I do think about Europe and some of our guests that come from Europe during harvest. We have interns. I think one of the guys this year, his family's had the same vineyard for how long?
300
years.
400 years.
Yeah.
So I think there is a counter narrative to I think Americans tend to think of family businesses as like, oh, the second or third generation is going to crash and burn and spend all the money, it's going to go away. But then I think particularly in the wine industry, we're so connected to other regions, in Europe and other parts of the world. Like there's a different model, and I think as Oregonians too, it's we have such a focus on sustainability, and that's sustainability too. So hopefully we'll see.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe we won't in 500 years. We'll see.
Joe, you have anything to add?
I think if we keep our land use laws to where people can't build 5-acre monstrosities, on all of our good hillside land where they love to plant houses. As long as we have a regulation that says you have to farm 40 acres and have income from that, from farming, and we protect that land, then there'll be new sites that can be planted. Don't plant houses.
Yeah. And even I think it's almost protect you from yourselves. We own over 800 acres in the Willamette Valley, and we don't need another house on even those 800 acres. We need more vineyards on those 800 acres. That's what you build a house, you get that's jobs for 1 year. Where you plant acres of vines, that's jobs for a lifetime. And that's jobs in agriculture, that's jobs in sales, that's jobs in administration.
We have 4 houses on 800 acres, right? Yeah. We have a couple double wides for one for our interns and one for one of our other vineyard workers, but we're not counting those. But 4 houses on 800 acres,
that's plenty.
Yeah.
We
More
need to
houses.
limit the population because they're predicting that Portland's population is going to double in the next 20, 30 years.
And we've got great small towns around Yamhill County that essentially. Those are amazing places for people to live, and if we keep taking farmland for housing, you're just going to lose the ability to grow crops and value-added jobs, things like that.
Yeah, I've talked to a few people who have come from other states that they'll be driving out, maybe even on a not so busy road, and they'll just be blown away because there's houses and then there's farmland. I mean, it is pretty amazing, and to me, also as an Oregonian, I love the fact that we can grow so many different kinds of crops here.
I don't know if you guys have talked about the fact that we've had farmers in our family for a long time too.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of what you're hearing is like the philosophy of our family and the fact that we do come from farmers and we think of ourselves as farmers.
Right.
I mean, I think of myself as a farmer, and I work on the computer all day.
Well, I was thinking, my great-grandfather, our great-grandfather was a dairy farmer, as was his father from Switzerland. My grandfather was a pear farmer.
And my grandfather was a hog farmer.
Yeah, and then these guys got to do grapes, and I just think, oh my gosh, how lucky are we? Grapes are pretty great.
It's the perfect value-added agricultural
You're
crop.
farming the internet.
Yeah.
It stayed in the family.
Yeah, and having value-added agriculture is,
it's
obviously
huge.
for Oregon is key because if we can take grapes and add value to them, create a quality product, send those wines out of state and overseas and bring dollars home to Oregon, that's good for all of us.
All right, well, those are the final questions that I have. Is there anything that you guys would like to add? Anything that I've missed, or?
You guys were really thorough.
I'll just mention that, Louis Pasteur once said, wine is the most healthful of beverages.
Yeah.
And it's still pretty good.
It was definitely true back then.
Back then, water was pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
All right, well, with that, I guess we'll end our interview.